In setting down the particulars of this singular adventure, I am conscious, as I have so often been before, that my pen must move between two obligations which are not always easily reconciled. The one is to be faithful to the truth, the other to preserve that very truth from premature disclosure, for it was the slow unveiling of hidden causes rather than any single dramatic stroke which gave this case its peculiar fascination. It is perhaps unnecessary to remind the reader that my friendship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes had by this time settled into that familiar rhythm which only long companionship can establish, my own professional engagements at times loosening, at times tightening our bond, but never wholly interrupting the singular privilege of sharing his confidence. It was in the winter of '88, during one of those weeks when London seemed to crouch beneath a lid of leaden cloud, and the very gas lamps burned as if ashamed of their own feeble yellow, that the affair of the stopped clock began. The morning had broken late, and even at 11 o'clock Baker Street lay muffled in a grey hush. A thin rain, almost invisible, swept in wavering threads across the windows, and the soot-stained panes gave back a blurred reflection of the room. Holmes stretched upon the sofa, with his long limbs flung out, the sharp aquiline of his profile outlined against the lamplight. Myself at the table with the Times spread before me more for the comfort of habit than from any expectation of news. Holmes had been silent for nearly an hour, which with him was never a sign of idleness. There was in that stillness a concentration which made one lower one's voice instinctively, as if the very air might disturb the invisible machinery of his thoughts. The only sound was the faint tick of the little French clock upon the mantel, a brisk, cheerful beat which always struck me as oddly domestic in that room of chemical apparatus. Persian slipper and violin case. At length he spoke, without turning his head. "You are reading the Times, Watson." "I am holding it," said I, with some defensiveness, for it is disconcerting to have one's actions named as if they were discoveries. "And yet you have not turned the page in 12 minutes. I glanced down in surprise. "Indeed? Therefore the paper is no longer holding you. Your mind is elsewhere." "My mind," I returned, amused in spite of myself, "is upon your curious habit of accusing the innocent. What possible sign could betray that I have not turned a page?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The crease of your thumb upon the margin remains in precisely the same place. Your left forefinger, which you use to steady the sheet when you turn, has not once lifted from the lower corner. You have, moreover, twice frowned at a column you have not read, which implies that the frown was directed not at printed matter, but at your own internal reflections. Now, Watson, you are not a man given to idle reverie. Something has annoyed you." "You may call it annoyance," said I. "It is rather an uneasiness." "Ah." He sat up, the thin lines of his face sharpening as they always did when the world offered him food. "Uneasiness has its causes. Let us have yours." I hesitated, for it seemed absurd to put into words an impression so slight that it might vanish at the moment of utterance. And yet Holmes had that gift, so rare, so valuable, of making even one's vaguest instinct feel worthy of examination. "It is nothing," I began, and then seeing his lifted eyebrow, capitulated. "It is simply that I have had, for 2 days, the sense of being watched." Holmes's eyes, those clear, steady eyes which could be at once as warm as a friend's and as cold as a scalpel, rested upon me. "Watched," said he. "By whom?" "That is precisely what I cannot say. It is a foolish fancy, I dare swear. Twice, as I have come from my surgery in Paddington, I have noticed a man behind me, a respectable man, I should add, not one of those loafers who haunt the streets. And last night, as I drew the curtain—" Holmes held up a hand. "Describe him," said he briskly. "Middle height," I answered, "broad in the shoulders, a dark coat, well kept, a bowler hat, his face—" "Yes?" "That is the strange part. I cannot recall it." Holmes's expression became suddenly intent, and, to my surprise, he sprang to his feet and crossed to the window. He drew the curtain back a few inches and peered out into the fog. "You have been watched for 2 days and cannot recall the watcher's face," said he. "That is not foolishness, Watson, that is method. A man who wishes to observe without being remembered will contrive to fix attention upon his general appearance, never upon his features. He may keep his head angled, his brim low, his gaze averted. He is not an amateur." "You alarm me." "Nonsense, you interest me." He let the curtain fall back and returned to the sofa with the lightness of one who has found a new thread in an old tapestry. "Now, let us see whether your watcher is connected with anything else. Have you, in these last days, treated any patient of uncommon circumstances, any case which might touch upon money, inheritance, scandal, or crime?" I considered. "Nothing of the sort." "Have you received any unusual letters?" "No." "Have you recently renewed acquaintance with any former military companion?" "Certainly not." Holmes steepled his fingers and stared at the fire. "Then perhaps," said he, "the simplest explanation is the right one. Someone has learned, Watson, that you share rooms with me." I could not help but laugh. "And therefore they watch the doctor. If they wish to watch you, Holmes, they might at least have the courage to watch you." "They would," said Holmes dryly, "if they were not afraid." "But if a timid man wished to learn my habits, my comings and goings, my visitors, he might very well observe my friend who is less likely to suspect him." "There is another possibility, of course." The sentence was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, followed almost instantly by Mrs. Hudson's voice, tremulous with that peculiar mixture of respect and excitement which always marked the arrival of some stranger upon urgent business. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it is most important, sir." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Show him up." A moment later the door opened and a man was ushered into our sitting room, whose appearance struck me as singularly out of place in Baker Street. He was perhaps 45 years of age, thin rather than gaunt, with a long, narrow face and eyes set close together beneath a heavy brow. His clothes were of good cut, but showed that particular neatness which is more common among those who serve the wealthy than among the wealthy themselves. Yet there was nothing servile in his manner. He held his hat stiffly between both hands, and the knuckles were white. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, though his gaze made it clear that he knew. Holmes inclined his head. "And this is Dr. Watson." The man bowed slightly to me, but his attention returned at once to Holmes as if drawn by magnetism. "My name is Alfred Hatherley," said he. "I am employed as private secretary and man of business to the late—" He stopped, and for the first time the composure of his face broke. "To Mr. Cornelius Vane of Wrotham House." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the quick interest in his eyes. Holmes knew, as did every man in London with the slightest acquaintance with society, the name of Cornelius Vane. He was one of those figures who move in the background of public life, never in Parliament, never upon a platform, yet always whispering in corridors, always at the elbow of men of influence, always, one felt, touching the levers of power with gloved fingers. Some called him a patriot, others a trafficker, and the newspapers, which had no facts, had long contented themselves with hints. "The late Mr. Vane?" said Holmes softly. "Yes," the man replied, and the words seemed dragged from him. "He is dead." Holmes gestured to the chair. "Pray sit down, Mr. Hatherley, and tell us what has occurred." Hatherley sat as one who has forgotten how to use his limbs. He placed his hat upon his knees, and his eyes darted about the room, taking in the chemical bottles, the coils of tobacco, the violin, as if seeking some reassuring sign that this was indeed the place where mysteries could be solved. "It is murder," said he, and then, as if fearing that the word itself might summon something, he lowered his voice. "Or, if not murder, then something so like it that I cannot separate the two." Holmes leaned forward. "Begin at the beginning." "The beginning," said Hatherley, is a clock." Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction. "A clock?" "Yes." Hatherley swallowed. "A long case clock, an old grandfather clock, if you please. It stands in Mr. Vane's library at Wrotham House. It has stood there for, well, since before my time with him. He was fond of it, sir. He would not have it altered or moved. He used to say—" Again he checked himself, and when he went on, his voice had the stiff cadence of a man repeating words he would rather not remember. He used to say that it was the only thing in the house that told the truth. Holmes's face remained composed, but I saw that he had not missed the curious phrase. "And this clock," said Holmes, "has some connection with his death." "It stopped," said Hatherley. "It stopped at the moment he died." There are certain statements which, though simple enough in themselves, strike the mind with disproportionate force because they hint at a deeper strangeness. The image of a tall, steady clock marking the solemn seconds and then halting as a man's life halted had in it something uncanny. I caught myself glancing instinctively at our own little mantel clock as if to reassure myself that it still ticked. Holmes, however, was not a man to indulge in impressions. "Clocks stop for many reasons," said he. "Their weights run down, their springs break, their pendulums are disturbed. Tell me of the circumstances." Hatherley drew a shaky breath and began, with the dogged exactness of one who has already told the story too often and still cannot make it sound less unbelievable. "Yesterday evening, at 9:15, Mr. Vane retired to his library, as was his custom. He had dined with two guests, Mr. Bernard Kettridge, his cousin, and Mr. Silas Mordaunt, a gentleman of business. I was present at dinner, as I always am. There was nothing out of the ordinary that I could observe, except that Mr. Vane seemed more restless than usual. He spoke little. Twice he went to the window and looked out at the grounds. He drank hardly any wine. Holmes's fingers moved as if he were playing invisible keys. "And after dinner?" "After dinner, sir, the guests withdrew to the drawing-room with Mrs. Vane." "Mrs. Vane?" I repeated before I could check myself. "I was not aware he was married." Hatherley glanced at me. "He married 2 years ago, Dr. Watson. Miss Eleanor Harcourt." Holmes's eyes flickered to me for an instant. He had, no doubt, read surprise in my tone and filed it away as an indication that this marriage, little spoken of in public, might carry significance. "Continue," said Holmes. "Mr. Vane went to the library," said Hatherley, "and I went with him, for there were papers he wished me to fetch. He sat at his desk. He told me—" The man's voice faltered. "He told me that no matter what I heard, I was not to disturb him for an hour." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "No matter what you heard?" "Yes, sir." He said it with emphasis. He had never said such a thing before. I asked him if he was unwell. He told me to do as I was told. "And you obeyed?" "I did, sir. I fetched the papers from the cabinet in the hall. There is a cabinet of iron with a key, and only he and I have access. I returned them to the library. He took them without looking up and dismissed me." "What papers were these?" asked Holmes. Hatherley's lips tightened. "Documents relating to certain investments. I cannot be more explicit, sir." Holmes waved it aside as one who knows when to postpone a point. "And then?" "I went to my own room on the second floor," said Hatherley, "which overlooks the east wing. The library windows are below. At 10 o'clock, precisely 10, I heard a sound." "What sound?" "A sharp metallic click," said Hatherley, and then seeing Holmes's look, he hastened to add, "as of something being struck. No, as of something snapping. It was very distinct. It came from the direction of the library." Holmes's head tilted slightly. "And you did not go down?" "I remembered his words," said Hatherley miserably. I waited. I told myself it might be the clock. He stopped and pressed his hand to his forehead. At a few minutes past 10, I heard Mrs. Vane scream. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Where was Mrs. Vane at that moment?" "In the drawing-room, sir, with the guests. That is on the west side of the house." "And she screamed. Why?" Because she went to the library, said Hatherley. She said afterward that she felt compelled to go. She could not explain it. She opened the library door and saw Mr. Vane lying upon the carpet. I felt a tightening in my chest. However many bodies I had seen in my own profession, there is something in the picture of a man laid out in his own house which always strikes harder. Who reached him first? Asked Holmes. Mr. Ketteridge and Mr. Mordaunt rushed in, said Hatherley. I came from upstairs as fast as I could. The servants were in an uproar. The butler sent for the police. I sent for the doctor. And the clock? Said Holmes quietly. Hatherley's eyes rose as if the word itself dragged them upward. The clock had stopped, said he. It stood in the corner, tall as a man. Its hands pointed to 10 minutes past 10. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon him. 10 minutes past 10? Yes. And what time did the doctor declare Mr. Vane to have died? Hatherley swallowed. 10 minutes past 10. A silence settled over the room. Even Holmes, who could strip sentiment from any event, seemed to recognize that here was coincidence of a kind which would seize the imagination of any household and turn it into fear. "And Mr. Vane's condition?" asked Holmes at last. He was dead," said Hatherley, his voice thickening. There was no blood. There was no wound that any of us could see. The doctor, Dr. Ashdown of Wrotham, said that he believed it to be apoplexy, but he clenched his hands. And Vane was not a man to fall dead like that. He was strong, hard. He had enemies, and there is more. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Yes? The key to the iron cabinet was missing, said Hatherley. I know, because I looked for it at once. It was always kept in his desk drawer in the library. The drawer was open. The key was gone. Holmes's voice was as soft as falling ash. And the papers you fetched? They were not in the room, said Hatherley. Not a single one. And the clock stopped, Holmes murmured, almost to himself. At the moment he died. Yes, said Hatherley. And there is another thing. When the police came, Inspector Lestrade himself, sir, he examined the library. He found a small piece of metal beneath the clock. Holmes's head snapped up. What sort of metal? A thin sliver, said Hatherley, curved like part of a spring. Holmes stood, and in that instant the whole room seemed to change, as if an invisible current had been switched on. He crossed to the mantel, took up his pipe, and began to fill it with deliberate care. I knew that this, with Holmes, was not a sign of leisure, but of intense thought. His mind worked best, I had observed, when his hands performed some familiar action. You have not told me, said he, what Scotland Yard thinks. Hatherley's mouth tightened. Inspector Lestrade thinks it is theft, said he. He thinks Mr. Vane surprised a burglar and died of fright or struggle. He thinks the clock was struck in the confusion and the spring broke, and that is why it stopped. And you? I think, said Hatherley in a low voice, that the clock is the key to it. I think it was not struck by accident. I think it was made to stop. Holmes drew a match along the box and lit his pipe. The flame illuminated his face for a moment, throwing into relief the keen lines of his cheek and the sharp set of his mouth. When he spoke, it was with that curious mixture of kindness and impatience which he reserved for those who brought him something truly interesting. Mr. Hatherley, said he, I have been asked to look into many strange affairs, disappearing racehorses, curious ciphers, blue carbuncles, and even the occasional jealous husband. But I confess that a clock which stops at murder is a novelty. Tell me, did you yourself touch the clock after the death was discovered? No, sir. Did anyone? I do not know, said Hatherley. There was confusion. Mrs. Vane was hysterical. Mr. Ketteridge he was very pale, sir, and he kept looking at the clock as if it were accusing him. Mr. Mordaunt, on the other hand, was quite calm. He said repeatedly that Mr. Vane had brought it on himself, which was a strange thing to say of a man lying dead. Holmes's eyes gleamed at the names like a hound scenting a trail. "And Mrs. Vane," said he. "What of her?" Hatherley hesitated. "She is, young," he said, "and she loved him, I think, though he was not always kind. But there were rumours, sir." "Rumours," said Holmes, with the faintest flicker of contempt. "Rumours are the refuge of the lazy. We shall have facts." He turned to me. "Watson," said he, "will you oblige me by putting your medical bag in readiness?" "You intend to go at once?" "Why not?" Holmes's eyes were alight. A man lies dead in his library. His papers vanish. A piece of spring lies beneath a stopped clock, and Scotland Yard calls it theft. It would be rude to let Lestrade have all the amusement. Hatherley half rose from his chair, relief and desperation mingling upon his face. "You will come, then?" Holmes nodded. "We shall take the next train. In the meantime, you will tell Mrs. Hudson to send a telegram to Inspector Lestrade informing him that I shall attend at Wrotham House this afternoon. And you will sit, Mr. Hatherley, and think back very carefully over every word spoken at that dinner, every gesture, every glance. In these matters, the smallest thing may be the hinge upon which the whole door turns." As Hatherley bowed and moved toward the door, I could not help remarking upon one detail which had struck me since his entrance. There was upon his right wrist, just visible beneath the cuff, a faint reddish mark, an abrasion as of a cord or strap. Holmes too saw it, for his eyes flicked there and then away. "You have been bound recently," said Holmes casually, as if speaking of the weather. Hatherley froze. The colour drained from his face. "No," said he, and the word came too quickly. Holmes smiled gently, but his gaze was unyielding. "A cord has rubbed your wrist," said he. "You have attempted to conceal the mark by pulling your cuff down. That is not the action of a man who has nothing to hide. We shall speak of it later." Hatherley made a strangled sound, half protest, half surrender, and then stumbled from the room as if pursued. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Holmes. "Bound?" I repeated. "Surely you do not suspect him?" "I suspect everyone," said Holmes, with that cold amusement which was one of his most exasperating traits. "But I accuse no one until I can prove. Mr. Alfred Hatherley is frightened, Watson. He has brought us the shape of a mystery and withheld its heart." He moved again to the window, drew the curtain aside, and peered out into the fog as he had done earlier. For a moment his face was still. "What is it?" I asked, following his gaze. "There is your watcher," said Holmes. I stared out. Across the street, half obscured by the drifting mist, a man stood beneath the awning of a closed shop. He wore a dark coat and a bowler hat, and he held a newspaper up before his face. Yet the paper did not move, and the posture was too rigid, too deliberate, to be that of a casual reader. Even at that distance I could not see his features. The brim shadowed them, and the fog did the rest. But I felt, with a sudden chill, that he had been there before. Holmes let the curtain fall and turned back into the room, his eyes bright with that peculiar delight which only the difficult and the dangerous could give him. "Come, Watson," said he, taking up his coat. "We have a clock to examine, and it seems a shadow to shake off." And so, with the fog pressing close about the windows and the little French clock on our mantel ticking cheerfully on as if in ignorant defiance of death, we set our affairs in order and prepared to follow Mr. Alfred Hatherley to Wrotham House, where time itself had stopped at murder. We lost no time in making our preparations. Holmes's movements, when once his mind was resolved, had always that swift economy which contrasted so sharply with his long spells of apparent indolence. Within a few minutes he had sent Mrs. Hudson for a hansom, scribbled a telegram in his quick, angular hand, and tucked into his pocket the inevitable magnifying lens and tape measure, which seemed as essential to him as a surgeon's instruments to myself. As we descended to the street, the fog closed round us like a living thing. The very air smelt of damp stone and coal smoke, and the lamps were pale blurs in the thick grey. Hatherley went before, his shoulders hunched as if against more than the cold, while Holmes and I followed at a little distance. I could not help turning once, twice, in the hope of catching a clearer glimpse of the watcher, but the street was already swallowed up behind us. Holmes, however, walked with his head slightly bent, as a man who listens with his eyes. "Do not look back so openly," he murmured. "You will only tell him that you have seen him. Then you are certain he follows." "I am certain he wishes you to think so," said Holmes. "That is a different matter." Hatherley climbed into the hansom first. Holmes motioned me in beside him, and in an instant we were rattling over the wet stones toward Paddington Station, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobbles and the driver's whip cracking like a pistol shot in the fog. For some time none of us spoke. The motion and the monotonous rumble of the wheels seemed to give Hatherley a momentary steadiness, for he sat with his eyes fixed upon the little window as if he feared to see some face appear there. Holmes, on the other hand, appeared almost languid, though I knew that every sense of his was alert. At last he broke the silence. "Mr.
Hatherley," said he, "about that mark upon your wrist." Hatherley started. "It is nothing." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "It is rarely nothing when a man lies about it."
"Was it made last night?" Hatherley's lips tightened. He stared at his hat as if it might offer him counsel. "Yes." "And by whom?" Hatherley's voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "By Mr. Vane?" Holmes's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Vane bound you?" "It was not," Hatherley swallowed, "it was not what you think."
"He did not take a rope and tie me like a criminal. He took my wrist and held it hard, sir, as he spoke. He pressed his fingers in so that it hurt."
"He said—" Again that same reluctance seized him, the reluctance of a man who repeats words that have poisoned his memory. "He said that if I failed him, he would make me wish I had never been born." Holmes's tone was very gentle. "And what was it that he feared you might fail to do?" Hatherley's eyes flicked up and then away. "I cannot say." Holmes leaned back, the faintest smile upon his lips. "You cannot, or you will not." Hatherley's hands clenched.
"It would ruin me," he said. It would ruin others." Holmes made a little sound between amusement and impatience. "Very good. We shall let the facts ruin whom they please."
We reached the station without further incident. The train for Wrotham was not due for nearly 20 minutes, and Holmes used the interval in that curious fashion of his, standing apart from the bustle, apparently doing nothing, yet in truth observing everything. I saw his eyes travel from a porter's boots to a lady's parasol, from a scrap of torn paper upon the floor to the soot upon a ticket collector's sleeve. It was as if London itself, in all its small disorder, was to him a readable page. It was during this interval that I noticed, with a sudden tightening, the man in the bowler hat. He stood near the bookstall, his back half turned, a newspaper in his hands. There was nothing remarkable in his posture. Indeed, it was his very ordinariness which made him difficult to grasp, like a face in a crowd that one cannot afterwards recall. Yet I would have sworn to that broad shoulder line, that precise tilt of the head. Holmes did not glance in his direction. His voice came quietly. "He is there, Watson."
"Do not stare." "Then you see him too?" "I saw him at Baker Street," said Holmes. "I see him now. He is not very skillful." "That was not your impression earlier."
"It was my impression that he wished you to think him skillful," Holmes returned. "There is an important difference. A true shadow does not announce itself twice in the same manner. This fellow is making sure that you and I are both aware. He wants us to carry him in our minds as we go to Wrotham." "Why?" Holmes's mouth tightened. "Because he wants us to look in the wrong direction." The whistle shrieked and steam hissed. We took our seats in a first-class carriage, Hatherley still rigid and pale. As the train began to move, I glanced through the window. The man in the bowler hat had stepped forward to the very edge of the platform. For an instant, only an instant, the fog eddied aside and I saw the lower part of his face, a neat, dark moustache and a mouth set in a line which was neither cruel nor kind, but merely determined. Then the platform slid away, and he was swallowed once more by the smoke and haze. Holmes had been watching me in the window reflection. "You saw him?"
"A moustache," said I, and a narrow mouth," said Holmes calmly. "Yes, I have seen it too." "You have?" Holmes's eyes gleamed.
When he leaned to buy his paper, his hat brim lifted for a second. Enough. He is not a man of the very lowest class, Watson. Note the cut of his coat and the polish on his boots. Yet he buys a halfpenny paper and stands at the edge of the platform like a clerk with something to hide, a man who wishes to look common. He is a messenger or a guard. A guard. "A man stationed to watch whether we truly go to Wrotham," said Holmes. "If we did not, he would report. If we do, he will report also." Hatherley, who had been listening in spite of himself, turned his head sharply. "Report to whom?" Holmes shrugged. "That is precisely what we shall discover if we are patient." The journey, though not long, seemed to me strangely drawn out, for the landscape outside was colourless and blurred with winter damp, and my thoughts were occupied with that stopped clock, that dead man, and the uneasy sense of unseen eyes. Holmes, as always, seemed more enlivened the deeper the mystery grew. He questioned Hatherley with a persistence which, though never brutal, was relentless in its quiet way. "Mr. Vane's guests," said he. "Tell me more of them. Mr.
"Bernard Kettridge, what is his relation?" "A cousin," said Hatherley, on his mother's side. He hesitated. "He has long hoped to inherit." Holmes nodded. "And Mr.
Silas Mordaunt?" "A financier," said Hatherley, with obvious distaste. "He and Mr. Vane were connected in business." "And Mrs. Vane?" Hatherley's eyes softened a fraction, as if that name carried for him a different weight. "She is gentle," said he. "She was too young for him."
"But—" He stopped, and that stop told me more than his words. "But there are rumours," said Holmes dryly. "Rumours of what?" Hatherley's face flushed. "Of a friendship between Mrs. Vane and Mr. Kettridge." "Ah," said Holmes. He said it lightly, yet I saw his mind seize the point as a hawk seizes prey.
"And the servants?" Holmes continued. "Any strange visitors? Any dismissal? Any quarrels?" "There was a new footman engaged a month ago," said Hatherley. "A fellow named Pike. He came with good references, but—" Holmes prompted. "But Mr. Vane did not like him," said Hatherley. "He said the man's eyes were too quick. He meant to dismiss him after Christmas." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And did he tell Pike this?" "No, sir. Only me." Holmes leaned back. So, a man to be dismissed, a cousin to inherit, a business partner to protect his interests, a wife with a suspected attachment, and a secretary whose wrist bears the mark of a threat. He tapped the ash from his pipe with a neat, decisive movement. "The house must be a very quiet one, Watson." The train slowed at last and drew into a small station where the air smelt of wet earth instead of smoke. A carriage awaited us, a dark brougham bearing the Vane crest upon its door. The coachman, a solemn fellow with whiskers, touched his hat to Hatherley. The grounds of Wrotham House lay a mile or so beyond, and as we drove the fog thinned, leaving a cold, raw daylight which showed bare hedges and leafless trees dripping with moisture. The house itself, when it came into view, was a great sombre mass of stone, its windows staring out like blind eyes. It had that look which large country houses sometimes have in winter, a look of unused rooms and chilled corridors, as if warmth and laughter had long since retreated from its walls. At the door we were met by a butler whose face was a model of propriety strained by terror. Somewhere within I could hear the faint sound of a woman weeping. "Mr. Holmes," said Hatherley, "Inspector Lestrade is in the library." Holmes's mouth curved. Excellent. I should not like to deprive him of his first impressions. We were led through a wide hall where portraits of stern men looked down from the walls, and along a corridor thick with the smell of wax and damp. The servants we passed drew back as if we carried contagion. At last Hatherley opened a heavy door, and we entered the library. It was a large room lined with books from floor to ceiling, the shelves dark and gleaming. A fire burned low in the grate, but it gave little warmth. The curtains were half drawn, and the day outside pressed in grey and colourless. In the corner stood the long case clock, tall, imposing, its polished wood catching what light there was. Its hands, sure enough, pointed to 10 minutes past 10. The pendulum was still. Near the centre of the room, upon the Persian rug, lay the body of Cornelius Vane. He was a large man, broad-chested, with a heavy jaw and grey hair brushed neatly back. Even in death there was something formidable in him, as if his will had not entirely yielded. His eyes were half closed, his mouth slightly open. There was no blood, no obvious wound. Inspector Lestrade stood near the desk, his hands thrust into his pockets, his lean face set in that expression of worried confidence which I had learned to recognize as his attempt to appear master of circumstances which were, in truth, slipping from him. A constable sat at a side table writing notes. A doctor, whom I took to be Dr. Ashdown, stood stiffly with his hat in his hand. Lestrade turned sharply as we entered. "Holmes!" he cried, with a mixture of relief and irritation. "So you've come down at last. You're late." Holmes glanced at the stopped clock with a faint smile. "Time has been standing still here, Lestrade. I could hardly be late." Lestrade grunted. "There's nothing supernatural about it, if that's what you're sniffing for. The thing was knocked. Spring broke. Simple." Holmes's eyes travelled, quick and quiet, over the room. The desk, the window, the rug, the body, the faces. "Simple," said he. "Yes, it often is when you have chosen the wrong simplicity." He knelt by the dead man with the practised ease of one who has done so many times, and I, prompted by my own profession, knelt beside him. Holmes did not touch the body at first. He merely looked at the hands, at the lips, at the faint bluish tinge at the ears, at the collar where it met the throat. Then he looked up at Dr. Ashdown. "You said apoplexy," said Holmes. "I did," replied the doctor stiffly. "The man dropped where he stood. No sign of violence, no struggle. What else would you have me say?" Holmes's fingers touched to the dead man's wrist lightly, almost affectionately, as if the pulse might still speak. "I would have you say," Holmes murmured, "whether he smelt of bitter almonds." Dr. Ashdown stiffened at Holmes's question, and for an instant the professional mask slipped. "Bitter almonds," he repeated. "You suggest poison?" "I suggest nothing," said Holmes mildly. "I ask questions. It is the business of others to jump to conclusions." The doctor bent reluctantly, inhaled near the dead man's mouth, and straightened again. I perceived no such odour. Holmes nodded, as if the answer had been expected. He rose and turned his attention to the body more closely, lifting the eyelids, examining the nails, the faint lividity settling along the neck. I watched him carefully, for in such moments he was never more himself, utterly detached, yet intensely humane in his respect for fact. "No convulsions," he murmured. "No clenched jaw, no sign of violent collapse." He glanced toward the rug. "And yet he fell here, not from his chair." Lestrade snorted. "Men have been known to stand and drop dead." "Indeed," said Holmes, "but they have also been known to be helped." He crossed to the desk. One drawer stood open. Holmes peered inside, then sniffed delicately. Recently opened, he said. And forcibly, I think. The wood fibres here. See them, Watson? Torn, not worn. Lestrade stepped closer, frowning. The key was missing. Burglar work. Possibly, said Holmes, but burglars usually take more than papers and leave clocks in distress. His gaze shifted again to the tall clock in the corner. He approached it slowly, as if the thing might resent his scrutiny. The polished case showed no obvious damage. Holmes crouched and examined the base, then the side, then the face. At last he straightened and looked at Lestrade. You found a piece of metal beneath this? Lestrade nodded and gestured to the constable, who produced a small envelope. Holmes took it, tipped the contents into his palm, and held it up to the light. It was, as Hatherley had said, a thin, curved sliver of steel, darkened at one edge. A spring fragment, said Holmes. Part of the clock's internal mechanism, though not the main spring. He looked keenly at Lestrade. Who removed it? No one, said Lestrade shortly. It was on the floor. Ah, said Holmes. On the floor, and yet the clock case is closed. He bent again, and with delicate fingers opened the clock's door. The interior was dim and intricate, a tangle of brass wheels and rods. Holmes's eyes flicked from one to another, noting what was present and what was not.
Interesting, he murmured. What is? Demanded Lestrade. The clock has been stopped, said Holmes, but not by violence, or rather, not by the violence you imagine.
Lestrade folded his arms. You think someone fiddled with it on purpose? I think someone understood it, Holmes replied. There is a difference. He closed the door and stepped back, studying the clock as a whole. This is an old piece, he went on. Late 18th century, perhaps, well maintained. It would not stop without reason, and if struck hard enough to break a spring, it would show it, here or here. He ran a finger along the wood. There is no mark. Lestrade looked unconvinced. Then how do you explain the timing? Holmes smiled thinly. Ah, the timing, that is what everyone is staring at, and therefore perhaps what they should stop staring at. He turned suddenly to Hatherley. When you heard the metallic click, did it sound heavy? Hatherley frowned, searching his memory. No, it was sharp, like something small snapping. Not the fall of a pendulum, said Holmes, nor the jar of a case. Something internal. He glanced again at the clock face. This clock was made to stop at 10 minutes past 10, he said quietly. A faint shiver ran through the room. Even Lestrade shifted his feet. That's nonsense, said the inspector. You make it sound as if the clock knew the time of death. No, said Holmes, as if the time of death was chosen. There was a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind us. I turned and saw Mrs. Vane standing at the door. She was a slight woman, pale and trembling, her dark hair drawn back simply. Her eyes were red, but there was a strange steadiness in them as she looked from the body to the clock and then to Holmes. You mean, she said very softly, that my husband's death was planned? Holmes bowed. Madam, I mean only that it was not accidental. Lestrade made an impatient sound. Mrs. Vane, you should not be here. She ignored him and stepped into the room. Mr. Holmes, she said, if you can tell me the truth, I beg you to do so. There has been too much whispering in this house already. Holmes regarded her gravely. The truth, Mrs. Vane, is often shy. It must be coaxed. Her mouth tightened. Then coax it quickly. Holmes inclined his head and turned back to the clock. May I ask, said he, whether anyone in this household was capable of repairing or adjusting that clock? The butler shifted uneasily. A man comes twice a year, sir. From London. A clockmaker, said Holmes. Name? I believe. The butler hesitated. I believe his name is Pike, sir. Hatherley started. Pike? But that is the footman's name. Holmes's eyes flashed. The same man? Yes, sir,
said the butler miserably.
He told us he had been apprenticed to the trade before taking service. Holmes's mouth curved slightly. A useful skill. Lestrade rubbed his chin. You think the footman meddled with the clock? I think, said Holmes, that the clock was meddled with by someone who knew it well enough to remove a particular spring, one which governs the striking mechanism, not the timekeeping itself. Remove it and the clock will cease to strike, but continue to mark the hour until the moment it is required to stop entirely. Lestrade stared. Required? Yes, said Holmes. The final stop could be achieved by a very slight disturbance, hardly enough to mark the case, or by a timed mechanism already weakened. He turned abruptly to the window. How far is it to the east wing? Hatherley answered. About 50 yards. And the windows below Mr. Hatherley's room, do they open onto this side? Yes. Holmes nodded. Then a sound from here, a small sharp click, might well carry upward at night. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. You suggest the clock was tampered with earlier, then at 10 minutes past 10, the man died, Holmes finished, and the clock, deprived of its integrity, obeyed.
But why? Demanded Lestrade. Why go to such trouble? Holmes looked at the body on the rug. Because a stopped clock fixes a moment in the mind.
It turns a death into a spectacle. Everyone remembers the time. Everyone talks of coincidence. It distracts from method. Mrs. Vane swayed slightly. I stepped forward, but she steadied herself with one hand on the desk. You speak as if you know how he died, she said. Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. I have a strong suspicion, he said, but I will not insult your intelligence by presenting it without proof. She hesitated, then said, My husband received a letter yesterday afternoon. After he read it, he was altered. Holmes's head came up sharply. A letter? Yes, she said. He crushed it in his hand. He burned it in the fire. He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to trust no one in this house. Lestrade looked startled. Why wasn't this mentioned before? Mrs. Vane's eyes flashed. Because no one asked me, Holmes nodded approvingly. What time did he receive this letter? Shortly before dinner. Holmes turned to Hatherley. And you fetched the papers afterward? Yes. Papers that were then removed, said Holmes. Papers likely connected with that letter. Lestrade's jaw set. This is all very clever, Holmes, but it still doesn't tell me how he was killed. Holmes walked back to the body and crouched once more. He pointed to the collar. Dr. Watson, said he quietly, what do you observe? I leaned closer.
There is a faint redness here, I said. And here, small punctate marks, almost invisible, Holmes nodded. Pressure points, very small, Lestrade frowned.
You mean strangulation? Not by hands, said Holmes, by something thinner, something that could be removed without trace. Silence fell again, heavy and expectant. A cord, I murmured. Holmes's eyes met mine. Or a wire, said he, something fine enough to leave little mark and to be concealed afterward. He straightened and looked slowly around the room. And if a man were threatened, he added softly, held fast by the wrist and told that failure would destroy him, he might well obey an order to bind another.
Especially if he believed that binding was only to restrain, not to kill. Hatherley's face had gone ashen. Mr. Holmes, he whispered, I never... Holmes raised a hand.
Later, said he, not here, not yet. He turned to Lestrade. The clock is not the murderer, said Holmes. It is the witness. And like many witnesses, it has been taught when to speak. He glanced once more at the stopped hands. 10 minutes past 10, he murmured. An excellent time to die if one wishes the world to look elsewhere. And with that he moved toward the door, leaving behind him a room full of staring faces, a dead man who seemed suddenly less silent, and a clock which, though still and dignified, had begun at last to tell its story. Holmes did not leave the library at once, despite the dramatic effect of his words. Instead, having planted in every mind the unsettling notion that the room itself concealed more than it revealed, he lingered with deliberate calm, as though daring the truth to
contradict him. "Lestrade," said he, turning back, "you will permit me a little freedom of movement within the house." The inspector hesitated, then shrugged.
"So long as you don't contaminate anything important." Holmes smiled faintly. "I assure you, anything important has already been contaminated, by assumption." He beckoned to me and moved first toward the writing desk. The leather blotter lay skewed, and Holmes adjusted it carefully, aligning it with the edge.
"Observe, Watson," he murmured. "A neat man, excessively neat. The drawer torn open, yet the rest undisturbed. A burglar does not trouble to preserve order."
He lifted a paperweight, a heavy bronze piece shaped like an astrolabe, and examined its base. "No blood," he said, "but faint grease, clock oil, perhaps." Lestrade, hovering nearby, snorted. "You see oil everywhere now." "Only where it belongs," Holmes replied. He moved next to the rug and knelt where the body had fallen. With infinite care, he lifted one corner. "Dragged," he said quietly. "Dragged?" Lestrade echoed. "A few inches," Holmes went on, "from the desk toward the center of the room, enough to place the body where it would be easily discovered, yet not so far as to suggest struggle." Mrs. Vane had remained by the door, pale but composed. Holmes looked toward her. "Madam," said he, "your husband was not attacked where he lies." She closed her eyes for a moment. "Where then?" "At the desk," said Holmes. "Standing, perhaps reading, perhaps arguing." Her hands clenched. "Arguing with whom?" Holmes did not answer directly. He straightened and crossed the room toward the door that led into the corridor. "Inspector," said he, "who has had access to this room since the death?" Lestrade ticked the names off on his fingers. "My men, the doctor, the butler, Mr. Hatherley, the family." "And the footman, Pike?" Lestrade hesitated. "Briefly, to carry messages." Holmes nodded. "That will suffice." He stepped into the corridor. The sound of Mrs. Vane's quiet weeping followed us for a few seconds and then faded as the door closed. The passage outside the library was long and dim, panelled in dark wood. Holmes paused, inhaled deeply, and smiled to himself. "Do you smell that, Watson?" "Polish," I said, "and damp." "Also," Holmes added, "metal, freshly abraded." He crouched and examined the skirting board. There, just above the floor, was a faint bright line where something hard had scraped away the polish. "A wire," Holmes murmured, "pulled taut, then released." He followed the mark with his eyes until it vanished beneath a narrow side door. "The servants' corridor," said Hatherley, who had followed us silently. "It leads to the back stairs." "Excellent," said Holmes. We proceeded along it, passing closed doors behind which the life of the house seemed to have retreated into whispers and dread. At the far end, Holmes stopped before a small, tidy room. "The footman's quarters," Hatherley said. Holmes knocked once and opened the door without waiting for reply. The room was empty. A narrow bed stood against the wall, its coverlet neatly folded. A chair held a jacket. Holmes lifted it, turned it, and examined the cuffs. "Clock oil," he said. "And here, metal filings." Lestrade, who had followed despite himself, frowned. "That proves nothing. He services the clock." "Precisely," said Holmes.
"And yet he is absent," Lestrade swore softly. "One of my men said he saw him not half an hour ago." Holmes crossed to the small washstand.
In the basin was water faintly clouded, and at the bottom lay something dark. He tipped the basin carefully and retrieved it. "A length of fine wire," he said, "recently cut." Lestrade's face hardened. "I'll have him found." "By all means," said Holmes, But do not expect him to be your murderer." Lestrade stared. "After all this—" "Pike," Holmes interrupted, "is a tool, a very convenient one. He understands clocks, he understands wire, and he understands orders." Hatherley made a strangled sound.
"You mean—" "I mean," Holmes said calmly, "that someone else designed this." He straightened and looked at Hatherley keenly.
"Hatherley, when your employer threatened you last night, what precisely did he demand?" Hatherley's shoulders sagged. He said that I was to obey Mr. Ketteridge in all matters concerning certain papers, that I was to do so without question." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And did he explain why?" "No." "But you did," Holmes pressed, "because you feared him." "Yes," Holmes nodded. "So, Mr. Vane binds his secretary, figuratively and almost literally, to his cousin. Then he dies. The cousin inherits. The secretary is left with guilt and silence." Lestrade looked grim. "You're saying Ketteridge—" "I am saying nothing yet," Holmes replied, "but I am beginning to admire the architecture of the thing." We returned toward the main corridor, and there nearly collided with Bernard Ketteridge himself. He was a pale, narrow man, expensively dressed, his eyes darting with poorly concealed agitation. "Inspector," he said sharply, "is this really necessary? My cousin lies dead, and strangers roam the house." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Strangers, sir, are often more attentive than family." Ketteridge flushed. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," said Holmes, "that you were observed looking frequently at the clock last night." Ketteridge's lips parted. "Anyone would." "Indeed," said Holmes, "but not with relief." There was a moment, only a moment, when Ketteridge's composure faltered. Then he recovered himself. "This is absurd," he snapped. "If you have questions, ask them properly." "I shall," said Holmes. "Tell me, did you write to your cousin yesterday?" Ketteridge hesitated. "Yes." "What did you write?" "That is private." Holmes's voice hardened. "It concerned certain papers, did it not? Papers you believed yourself entitled to." Ketteridge laughed nervously. He was ill. He could not be trusted with them. "Yet he was well enough," Holmes said, "to threaten his secretary, bind his obedience, and arrange a meeting with his wife after dinner." Ketteridge's face had gone white. "You have no proof." "Not yet," Holmes agreed pleasantly. At that moment a constable hurried toward Lestrade. "Inspector, we've found the footman. He was trying to leave the village." Lestrade turned sharply. "Bring him in." Holmes watched Ketteridge closely as the news was delivered. The man's relief was unmistakable. "There," Ketteridge said quickly. "You see, your criminal." Holmes smiled thinly. "No, sir. Only my witness." A few minutes later, Pike was brought in, sullen, frightened, his eyes darting from face to face. Holmes approached him gently. "You adjusted the clock," said Holmes. "You weakened it. You placed the wire." Pike swallowed. "I was told to." "By whom?" Pike's gaze flicked, only once, toward Ketteridge. Holmes nodded. "And when Mr.
Vane resisted?" "I didn't mean it," Pike stammered. "He struggled, the wire—" Holmes raised a hand. "Enough." He turned to Lestrade. "The mechanism is clear," he said.
The clock was prepared to stop at the moment the struggle ended. The sound Mr. Hatherley heard was the final failure of the weakened spring as the wire was released. The clock fixed the time. The cousin secured the papers. The footman fled. The secretary was left bound by fear. Lestrade exhaled slowly. "And the watcher in London?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "A man hired to ensure that if I were summoned, I was followed, and misled if possible." He looked at Watson, at me, and smiled faintly. "You see, my dear fellow," said Holmes, "even a stopped clock can be made to run, if one knows where to apply the pressure." And as Lestrade began issuing orders and Pike broke down in tears, and Bernard Ketteridge's protestations rang hollow against the weight of accumulating fact, I found my gaze drawn once more to the tall, silent clock in the corner. It no longer seemed uncanny, it seemed obedient. The orderly certainty with which Holmes delivered his conclusions had an effect upon the company that was almost physical. Pike sagged as though some internal support had been removed, while Bernard Ketteridge stood rigid, his expression fixed in a brittle smile that fooled no one who had watched him closely during the past hour. Lestrade, for his part, rubbed his chin and paced once across the corridor, the wheels of his practical mind audibly grinding to accommodate this more intricate machinery of crime. "Very neat, Holmes," he said at last, "but neatness isn't proof. A frightened footman's glance isn't enough to hang a gentleman." Holmes inclined his head. "I would be disappointed if you thought it was." He turned back to Pike, who stood twisting his cap between trembling fingers. "You were paid," Holmes continued quietly. "Not merely threatened." Pike nodded miserably. "He gave me £5 in advance, said there'd be more when it was done." "When what was done?" "When the clock stopped," Pike whispered. A murmur ran through the small gathering of servants who had gathered at a respectful distance. Even Ketteridge's composure wavered. Lestrade stopped pacing. "You were told the clock was the important thing?" "Yes, sir. He said—" Pike swallowed. "He said it would make everyone look at the wrong moment instead of the wrong man." Holmes smiled faintly. A phrase worthy of its author. Ketteridge laughed sharply. "This is absurd. A servant repeats some nonsense, and suddenly I am accused." Holmes turned to him with sudden coldness. "You are not accused," said he. "You are being explained." Ketteridge flushed. "Explain, then?" "With pleasure," said Holmes. You wrote to your cousin yesterday pressing him regarding documents which would place you in control of certain financial ventures. He refused. You knew he had begun to mistrust you. You also knew his habits, his reliance upon routine, his affection for that clock, his desire for theatrical symbolism. You exploited all three. "You cannot prove that," Ketteridge snapped. Holmes glanced toward Mrs. Vane, who stood pale but attentive at the end of the corridor. "Madame," said he, "your husband burned a letter yesterday. Did he say from whom it came?" She nodded slowly. "From Bernard." Ketteridge took a step forward. "Eleanor?" Holmes raised a hand. After dinner, Mr. Vane went to his library to confront what he believed would be a final act of defiance. He believed himself secure. He had arranged matters so that his secretary would obey you, and he underestimated your impatience. "You make it sound very dramatic," Ketteridge said hoarsely. "Dramatic men," Holmes replied, "often choose dramatic ends." He turned back to Pike. "You adjusted the clock earlier that day. You weakened the striking spring so that it would fail under minimal stress. You ran the wire through the corridor, here." He pointed to the faint mark along the skirting board, so that it could be drawn tight around the victim's throat from behind. When he struggled, the wire was released, the spring failed, and the clock stopped, all attention fixed upon time. Pike nodded, tears running freely now. "I didn't know he'd die so quick." Holmes's voice softened slightly. "But you knew he might." "Yes," Pike whispered. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "And the papers?" Holmes looked at Ketteridge. "Already secured, I imagine. Hidden somewhere you believed no one would think to look." Ketteridge's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the library. Holmes followed the glance. "Ah," he said, "the desk was too obvious, but the clock—" He smiled. "A hollow case, accessible only to one who knew its interior." Lestrade swore under his breath and strode toward the library, Holmes at his heels. I followed, my heart beating faster as the final pieces fell into place. The clock loomed over us once more, tall and dignified, its hands still marking that fatal minute. Holmes opened the case and reached inside, his fingers moving with confidence among the brass and steel. A moment later, he withdrew a folded packet of papers. "There we are," said Holmes quietly. Lestrade took them and scanned the top sheet. His face hardened. "Financial transfers, signatures, enough to put a rope round a man's neck."
Kettridge's shoulders slumped. "You don't understand," he said weakly. He was ruining everything. He had no right." Holmes turned on him sharply.
"You confuse desire with right, sir. A common but fatal error." Lestrade motioned to his men. "Take him." As the constables moved forward, Kettridge made no further resistance. The energy seemed to have drained from him entirely, leaving only a pale, bitter shell. Mrs. Vane sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Holmes approached her gently. "Madame," said he, "your husband's life was entangled in many darker threads. His death was not your doing." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. "He knew," she said softly. "He knew it was coming." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and that knowledge shaped everything he did that evening." Lestrade cleared his throat. "There's still one thing, Holmes, the watcher in London," Holmes smiled. "Ah, yes, our shadow." "He followed you," Lestrade said. "Why?" "To ensure that if I were consulted," Holmes said, "certain precautions could be taken, a warning passed, documents moved, perhaps even an escape attempted." "And now?" Holmes shrugged. "Now his purpose has evaporated. He will vanish." As if in answer, a constable hurried in from the front hall. "Inspector, there was a man asking questions outside. He slipped away when we approached." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely." The formalities occupied the next hour. Statements were taken. Pike was led away, sobbing. Kettridge followed in silence. The house, which had seemed earlier to crouch beneath a weight of dread, began slowly to exhale, though sorrow still lingered in every corner. As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused once more before the clock. With a deft movement, he replaced the damaged spring and set the pendulum swinging. The familiar tick resumed, steady and unremarkable. "Do you mean to leave it running?" I asked. "Why not?" said Holmes. "It has done its duty." We took our leave of Mrs. Vane, who thanked Holmes with a quiet dignity that moved me more than any effusive gratitude could have done. Outside, the afternoon light was already fading, and the bare trees stood black against a leaden sky. As our carriage rolled away from Wrotham House, I ventured a question which had troubled me since the beginning. "Holmes," said I, "did Cornelius Vane suspect how he would die?" Holmes leaned back, his long fingers steepled. "He suspected danger," he said, "but he believed himself clever enough to manage it. He tried to control every man around him, to bind them to his will. In the end, he bound the wrong one." "And the clock?" Holmes smiled faintly. "A symbol chosen by the murderer and misunderstood by everyone else. It marked not destiny, Watson, but vanity." The carriage wheels rattled on, carrying us back toward London, while behind us the great house settled once more into silence. And as I watched the grey countryside slide past, I reflected, as I so often had, upon the curious irony that a thing designed to measure time had in this case merely revealed how little control any man truly has over it. The return journey was a quieter one. The carriage bore us away from Wrotham House through lanes already darkening into evening, and the bare branches of the trees scraped softly against one another in the rising wind, like fingers restless with secrets not yet fully spent. Mrs. Vane's pale figure lingered in my thoughts, as did the stillness of that library and the resumed ticking of the clock, now restored to its mundane office as if it had never borne witness to death. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame relaxed, his eyes half closed. I knew better than to take this for exhaustion. It was the posture of a man whose mind was still in motion, reviewing each step, discarding nothing, testing everything. "You have been silent," I ventured at last.
Holmes opened his eyes. Have I? He smiled faintly. Then I am thinking clearly. There is one matter, I said, which still troubles me. Only one? He asked dryly.
The watcher, you spoke of him as if he were an afterthought, yet he followed us deliberately, even boldly. Holmes nodded. Because his purpose was limited. He was not there to interfere, only to observe. Men like Ketteridge rarely trust a single safeguard. He wished to know whether I would be engaged and how quickly. And if you had not gone to Wrotham, then our friend would have reported back, Holmes replied, and certain papers would have disappeared more thoroughly. Possibly Pike would have vanished as well. Contingencies upon contingencies, Watson. The modern criminal is a great admirer of administrative thoroughness. And now? I pressed. Now, said Holmes, he has no master to report to. Such men dissolve very quickly when deprived of instruction. We reached the station without incident and took the evening train back to London. The carriage was nearly empty, and the rhythmic motion of the wheels seemed to lull the world into a deceptive calm. It was only when we drew into Paddington and stepped once more onto the familiar platform that I sensed Holmes's attention sharpen. He paused, ostensibly to light his pipe, and allowed the small crowd to pass us by. His gaze flicked from face to face with the rapid precision of a marksman. There, he murmured without moving his lips. I followed his eyes and saw him, the man with the bowler hat, standing near a pillar, his newspaper folded beneath his arm. He did not look at us, yet his posture betrayed awareness. Holmes moved at once, striding forward with such directness that the man started visibly. For a moment it seemed he might run, but Holmes's quiet authority checked him. "A word," said Holmes. The man hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "I believe," Holmes continued conversationally, "that you have been employed to observe my movements over the past 2 days. The man's mouth tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do," Holmes said pleasantly. "You have been admirably consistent. Same hat, same paper, same careful avoidance of direct gaze. A pity about the shoes, though. You changed them this morning. That betrayed a certain nervousness." The man glanced down involuntarily. "You will find," Holmes went on, "that your employer is no longer in a position to remunerate you, nor to protect you." The man swallowed. "I was only told to watch. No harm in that?" "None at all," said Holmes, "provided you now forget everything you have seen." The man hesitated, then nodded once and melted into the crowd with astonishing speed. Holmes turned back to me, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. "A sensible fellow," said he. "He knows when the game is over." We took a cab to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual mixture of concern and curiosity, which Holmes gently but firmly deflected. Once alone, he tossed his coat aside and stretched himself upon the sofa with a sigh that was half contentment, half dismissal. "And now," said he, "you wish me to explain." I smiled. I should never forgive myself if I did not. Holmes folded his hands upon his chest. Ketteridge was a man of moderate intellect and excessive impatience. He wanted the papers quickly and cleanly. The clock offered him both a hiding place and a spectacle. He relied upon two assumptions, that Pike would be pliable and that time itself would distract from agency. "And the letter?" I asked. "A provocation," said Holmes. He wished to draw Vane into confrontation. Men who believe themselves secure often grow careless when challenged. And Vane's threat to Hatherley? "A desperate attempt at control," Holmes replied. Vane sensed betrayal but could not identify its source. He bound those nearest him, hoping to secure obedience. In doing so, he created the very conditions which allowed Ketteridge to act. I considered this in silence for a moment. Then in the end, I said, it was not the clock which betrayed him, but his own habits. Holmes smiled faintly. "Clocks, Watson, merely repeat what we teach them. Men are far less reliable." The little French clock upon the mantel chimed the hour. Holmes glanced at it, then away. There is a certain poetry, he said lightly, in a man arranging his crime around time and being undone by patience. And Pike? I asked. He will testify, said Holmes. He is frightened, remorseful, and, most importantly, alive. Courts have a weakness for such witnesses. And Mrs. Vane? Holmes's expression softened. She will be free, he said, perhaps for the first time since her marriage. He rose at last and took up his violin, drawing from it a low, reflective phrase that filled the room with a sense of closure more eloquent than words. I sat and listened, reflecting upon the strange journey from a fog-bound street in Baker Street to a silent library where time itself had seemed to falter. When Holmes laid the violin aside, he yawned. "I think," said he, "that I shall sleep well tonight." "And tomorrow?" I asked. Holmes smiled, that familiar, enigmatic smile which never failed to awaken both curiosity and anticipation. "Tomorrow," said he, "we shall see what other clocks London has allowed to run unchecked." And with that, as the fire burned low and the city settled into its nocturnal murmuring, the case of the clock that stopped at murder passed into memory, another testament, for me at least, to the enduring truth that while time may measure our days, it is the smallest human choices that determine how they end. The night passed without incident, yet I awoke with that peculiar sensation which sometimes follows a taxing case, the sense that, though the principal mystery has been resolved, some smaller cog in the machinery has not yet quite found its proper place. Holmes, when I came into the sitting room the following morning, was already dressed and seated by the window, his chin resting upon his hand, his eyes fixed upon the slow awakening of Baker Street. "You slept well?" he asked, without turning. "Soundly," I replied. "You?" "Exceptionally," said Holmes, "which is always a sign that something has been satisfactorily finished." "And yet," I ventured, "you do not look as though your mind were at rest." Holmes smiled. "My mind, Watson, is never at rest. It merely changes its posture." He gestured toward the chair opposite him, and I sat, watching the familiar play of light upon his keen features. "There is a loose end," he continued, "not one that threatens justice, but one that threatens completeness." "The Watcher again?" "In part," said Holmes, "but more particularly why Ketteridge chose such elaboration when simpler means lay ready to hand." "Greed," I suggested. "Fear of suspicion?" Holmes shook his head. "Fear, yes, but not of suspicion, of something else." He rose abruptly and crossed to the mantel, where the little French clock ticked steadily. "Ketteridge was not afraid of the police," Holmes said. "He was afraid of time." I looked at him. "Time?" "He was under pressure," Holmes went on. "Financial pressure. Those papers he coveted were not merely advantageous, they were urgent. Delay would have ruined him. He could not wait for inheritance by natural means, nor risk a scandalous struggle. He needed the death to appear inevitable, preordained." "You mean natural," I said. "Or at least ambiguous," Holmes corrected. "Hence the clock. It fixed the moment, it suggested fate, and in doing so it gave him a narrative he could cling to."
I reflected for a moment, and yet he failed. "He failed," said Holmes, "because he misunderstood narrative."
He believed that if everyone spoke of time, no one would speak of motive. But motive, Watson, has a way of surfacing when time is examined too closely. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a salver. "Inspector Lestrade, sir." Holmes smiled faintly. "Send him up." Lestrade arrived, looking tired but satisfied, the lines of his face softened by the rare pleasure of a case well wrapped. "Ketteridge has confessed," he said without preamble. "Not to everything, mind you. He insists he never meant for Vane to die." "Few men ever do," said Holmes. "But he admits to hiring Pike, to moving the papers, to arranging the Watcher. That fellow you spoke to at Paddington turned up this morning and corroborated it all. Took a bit of persuading." Holmes nodded. "And Pike?" "Broken," said Lestrade. "He'll testify, Says Kettridge promised him a new start abroad. Fool. Holmes's eyes softened briefly. Most criminals promise escape. Few deliver. Lestrade shifted his weight. There's one thing more. The letter Vane burned. We recovered the ashes from the grate. Enough remained to make out part of it. And? Holmes asked. It warned him, Lestrade said. Someone else warned him, not Kettridge. Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. Indeed, Lestrade produced a small slip of paper. The handwriting doesn't match Kettridge's, nor Pike's. It reads, what we can make of it. The clock is against you, do not trust, and then it's gone. I felt a stir of surprise. Then Vane was warned? Yes, said Lestrade, and he ignored it. Holmes leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. That explains much. Explains what? Lestrade asked. Vane's restlessness, Holmes replied. His threats. His attempt to bind Hatherley to obedience. He knew something was moving against him, but not where it lay. He mistook the direction of danger. And the warning? Lestrade pressed. From whom? Holmes smiled faintly. That, Inspector, is a matter of speculation rather than proof. Perhaps a business rival, perhaps even a guilty conscience at work within Kettridge himself, testing whether his cousin might yet withdraw. Lestrade grunted. You always leave one shadow standing. Holmes inclined his head. Shadows are useful. They remind us where the light is. After Lestrade had taken his leave, Holmes returned to the window. The street below was alive now with the morning's commerce. Clerks hurrying, costermongers calling, a policeman pausing to speak with a child.
Do you regret, I asked, that we may never know who sent the warning? Holmes shook his head. No, the warning served its purpose.
It told Vane the truth he refused to hear, that his time was no longer his own. He turned toward me. Tell me, Watson, had you received such a letter, what would you have done? I should have sought help, I said after a moment. Or fled. Holmes smiled. Precisely, Vane did neither. He believed himself indispensable. That belief killed him. The clock chimed again, and Holmes glanced at it with a look of mild amusement. It is curious, he said, how often men attempt to enlist objects in their schemes, clocks, letters, mechanisms, as if these things could share responsibility. In truth, they merely reflect the mind that uses them. I thought of the tall clock at Wrotham House, standing silent and dignified once more, and of the hands that had pointed so accusingly to a single moment. Will you ever write this up? Holmes asked suddenly. I intend to, I replied, if you permit it. He waved a hand. Do as you please, only be kind to the clock. I laughed. You fear it will be misunderstood? I fear, said Holmes lightly, that someone will credit it with intelligence. He took up his violin once more, but instead of playing, he merely adjusted the strings, listening to the soft twang of each as it came into tune. There is another case waiting, he said, a smaller one, a man who insists that his watch runs backward. And does it? I asked. Holmes smiled, that familiar spark of anticipation returning to his eyes. No, said he, but he does. And as the sound of the city swelled around us and time resumed its steady, indifferent march, I prepared myself once more to observe and to record the singular ways in which my friend Sherlock Holmes pursued truth, not by bending the world to his will, but by understanding more clearly than any man I have known the hidden rhythms by which it already moves. The remainder of that day passed in a manner so outwardly uneventful that, had I not known Holmes as well as I did, I might have believed the affair wholly concluded. Yet there was in his demeanour a quiet attentiveness, as though he were listening for an echo that had not yet fully died away. He read for a time, made a few chemical notes in his notebook, and even indulged in a languid scale upon the violin, but always with that underlying alertness which told me his thoughts were still pacing measured circuits around the case. Toward evening, he laid his book aside. Watson, said he, do you recall Mr. Hatherley's wrist? Very clearly, I replied. The mark left by Vane's grip. Yes, Holmes said. A small thing, but it interests me still. In what way? Holmes leaned back. Because it was unnecessary. Vane was a man accustomed to command. He rarely descended to physical emphasis. That he did so suggests that the threat he perceived was not abstract, but immediate. You mean he feared something would happen that very night? Precisely, said Holmes.
And yet the warning letter arrived earlier that day. I frowned. Then why wait until after dinner? Holmes smiled faintly. Because Vane believed in ritual.
Dinner, the library, the clock, all were part of a personal mythology. He wanted control to the end, even if the end was already moving toward him. I was considering this when the doorbell rang below, sharp and insistent. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed almost at once. "Another visitor, Mr. Holmes," she called. A gentleman who says his business concerns Wrotham House. Holmes's eyes lit. "There we are," he murmured. "Send him up." The man who entered was unfamiliar to me. A tall, spare individual with iron-grey hair and a reserved manner. He carried himself with the quiet assurance of one accustomed to being listened to rather than questioned. "My name is Jonathan Hale," said he. "I was Mr. Cornelius Vane's solicitor." Holmes gestured to a chair. "I was wondering when you might appear." Hale inclined his head. "I have delayed until matters were clarified." "And now?" Holmes prompted. "Now," said Hale, "I feel compelled to correct one impression which may mislead the authorities." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Which impression?" "That my client was entirely unaware of the manner of his death," Hale replied. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "You believe he anticipated it," said Holmes. "I know he did," Hale answered calmly. Holmes leaned forward. "Explain." 2 weeks ago," Hale said, "Mr. Vane altered his will, quietly. He left explicit instructions that, should he die suddenly, certain documents were to be placed at once in my hands and not examined by any relative. Documents which were later stolen," Holmes observed. "Yes," said Hale, "documents which he feared would be used against others and against himself." Holmes nodded slowly. "And yet he left them accessible." "Because he intended them to be taken," Hale said. The words hung in the air. "You suggest," I said, "that he baited the trap." Hale met my gaze. "I suggest that Mr. Vane believed exposure preferable to prolonged uncertainty. He knew Ketteridge's character. He suspected Pike. He hoped that by allowing events to unfold, the truth would reveal itself." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A dangerous philosophy." "Indeed," said Hale. "It cost him his life." Holmes considered this in silence. "Then the warning letter was mine," Hale said simply. "I urged him to act, to withdraw, to place himself under protection. He refused." Holmes smiled sadly. "Men who live by control rarely surrender it gracefully." Hale rose. "I have said what I came to say. Good evening, gentlemen." When he had gone, Holmes remained thoughtful for some time. "So," I said at last, "Vane was not merely a victim." "No," Holmes replied, "he was a participant, not in the crime itself, but in the conditions that allowed it." "And the clock?" Holmes glanced at the mantel. "Still a witness, but now we see that it was also a lure." Night settled over Baker Street, and the lamps cast long reflections upon the wet pavement. Holmes sat by the fire, his face half in shadow. "There is a temptation," he said quietly, "to see villains and innocents as fixed categories. Life is rarely so accommodating. Vane's death was engineered by another, yet made possible by his own choices." "You sound almost sympathetic." "I am observant," Holmes corrected. "Sympathy clouds judgment." I smiled. "And yet you spare him harsh words." "Because," Holmes said, "he understood something at the end. He understood that time, once weaponized, turns upon its wielder." The clock chimed softly, and for a moment we both listened. "Watson," Holmes went on, "you will write this case. When you do, resist the urge to make the clock mystical." "I shall portray it as you have shown it to be," I replied. "An instrument, nothing more." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Good. Mysteries do not require magic, only patience." He stood and stretched. "That will be all for tonight." As I prepared for bed, my thoughts returned once more to Wrotham House, to the tall clock now ticking dutifully on, to the papers hidden and recovered, to the intricate web of motive and misjudgment that had converged upon a single minute. In the morning, London would move on, indifferent and brisk. The case would be recorded, the guilty punished, the innocent spared what peace they could reclaim. Yet somewhere, I reflected, there would always be another clock, ticking steadily in some shadowed room, waiting for a man foolish enough to believe he could command it. And so ended, not with drama but with understanding, the affair of the clock that stopped at murder, a case which taught me, more than most, that time does not conspire against us. It merely reveals with relentless honesty the consequences of our own design. The following days brought with them that peculiar lull which often succeeds a case of magnitude, a quiet interval during which the world appears to have resumed its customary order, though one knows that, beneath the surface, lives have been irrevocably altered. Holmes settled once more into his habits with an ease that might have suggested forgetfulness, had I not observed how often his thoughts strayed back, unbidden, to the affair of Wrotham House. On the third morning after Mr. Hale's visit, I found him seated at the table with a sheaf of papers spread before him. They were not chemical notes, as I had expected, but legal documents, annotated in Holmes's precise hand. "You have taken an interest in wills now?" I remarked lightly. Holmes glanced up. "In consequences," he replied. "These are copies. Lestrade forwarded them. Vane's final testament." "And does it alter your view of the matter?" "It confirms it," Holmes said. "He disinherited Ketteridge entirely." I raised my eyebrows. "Then Ketteridge's urgency was well-founded," Holmes finished. "Had he waited even a week, the papers would have been useless to him. Vane had already set his affairs in order." I considered this in silence. "Then, in a sense," I said slowly, "Vane won." Holmes shook his head. "No man wins by arranging his own death, Watson. At best he chooses the manner of his defeat." Later that afternoon we received a final communication from Lestrade, brief and characteristically practical. Ketteridge had been formally charged. Pike had agreed to testify. The evidence, bolstered by Hale's statement and the recovered documents, was considered decisive. The inspector added in a postscript that the clock from Wrotham House had been taken into custody as an exhibit, much to the annoyance of the widow. Holmes read this with a faint smile. "Mrs. Vane will have it returned," he said. "I shall see to that." "And why take such trouble?" I asked. "Because," Holmes replied, "it was never truly part of the crime, it was merely conscripted." True to his word, Holmes wrote that very evening, and within the week the clock was restored to its place in the library. Mrs. Vane sent a short note of thanks, dignified and restrained, expressing her intention to leave Wrotham House and begin anew. Holmes read it silently and placed it in the fire. "Some things," he said, watching it curl and blacken, "are best allowed no further echo. As for the watcher, the quiet man in the bowler hat, he was never seen again, and no effort was made to find him." Holmes maintained, with some amusement, that such men survive by perfecting the art of erasure. "He will already have another employer," Holmes said, "or none at all. Either way, he has learned something valuable." "And that is?" I asked. "That proximity to truth is dangerous," Holmes replied, "even when one does not touch it." One evening, as autumn deepened and the fogs returned to London with their accustomed persistence, Holmes and I sat together by the fire. I had begun drafting my account of the case and paused frequently, uncertain how best to render certain subtleties without diminishing them. "You hesitate," Holmes observed. "I am struggling," I admitted, "with how to end it." Holmes smiled faintly. Endings are always artificial. Life does not pause obligingly for a final paragraph. Nevertheless, I said, readers expect some sense of closure. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. Then give them reflection, not resolution. I returned to my pages, considering his words. You are remarkably philosophical for a man who professes indifference. Indifference, Holmes said, is merely discipline misinterpreted. There was a pause, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Do you know, Holmes continued, why the clock fascinates people so? Because it stopped, I suggested. No, he said, because it usually doesn't. We invest continuity with trust. When that trust is broken, we search for meaning. And sometimes invent it, I added. Precisely. He rose and stood by the window, gazing out at the misted street below. The danger lies not in mystery, Watson, but in our eagerness to attribute intention where there is only mechanism, or to ignore intention because mechanism is easier to blame. I thought of Cornelius Vane, of Bernard Ketteridge, of the quiet, obedient Pike, and of the silent clock that had borne so much scrutiny. Then the true lesson, I said, is not about time at all. Holmes turned, smiling. It rarely is. Some days later, as I was preparing to post the completed manuscript to my publisher, Holmes stopped me. One request, he said. Name it. Do not allow the reader to believe that cleverness alone solved this case, I smiled. What should I say then? That it was solved, but solved, Holmes replied, by attention. And the clock? By restraint, said Holmes. It told its story only because it was not asked to tell more. I sealed the envelope and placed it aside. That night, as I lay awake listening to the distant sounds of London settling into sleep, I reflected upon the curious truth of that statement. The clock at Wrotham House had not pointed accusingly of its own accord, it had merely waited. It was men who rushed to interpret it, to enlist it, to bend it into meaning. Holmes, I knew, would move on without regret, already attuned to the next irregular rhythm that demanded his attention. As for myself, I was content to linger a while longer upon this case, to trace once more its careful logic and measured unfolding. For in the end, it was not the moment at which the clock stopped that mattered most, but all that had been set in motion long before, choices made, warnings ignored, control, mistaken for mastery. And so, with the steady ticking of our own clock marking the passage of another ordinary night, I concluded my account of the affair, grateful, as ever, to have stood beside a man who understood better than any other I have known that time does not deceive us, we deceive ourselves. It was some weeks later, when the affair had already begun to settle into that curious half-life which distinguishes memory from immediacy, that Holmes himself returned to it, and in a manner so characteristic that I should reproach myself were I to omit it. I had just finished correcting the proofs of my narrative when Holmes entered the sitting-room, a folded newspaper in his hand, and an expression of mild amusement upon his face.
"You have made a small stir," said he. "In what way?" I asked. Holmes handed me the paper.
There was a short paragraph in one of the inner columns, a review, unsigned and faintly condescending, which praised the atmosphere of my account, while gently questioning whether the roll of the clock had not been overemphasized for dramatic effect. I looked up, irritated. "They miss the point entirely," Holmes chuckled. "On the contrary, Watson, they have seized upon it." "How so?" "Because they speak of drama," Holmes replied. "You and I know it was never dramatic. It was methodical, almost dull, until one considers what was concealed beneath that dullness." He seated himself and stretched his long legs toward the fire. "Tell me, if the clock had never stopped, would anyone have noticed its mechanism?" "Certainly not," I said. "And if no one had noticed the mechanism, would anyone have examined the hands that adjusted it?" I smiled. "You argue that the crime depended upon being noticed." "Exactly," said Holmes. "Ketteridge relied upon attention. He assumed it could be directed and exhausted at will. He underestimated the persistence of curiosity. There was a brief silence, during which the fire settled and the familiar sounds of Baker Street drifted faintly upward.
"Do you ever wonder," I asked, "whether Vane intended you to be involved?" Holmes considered this. "No. Why not?"
"Because," said Holmes, "men who believe they are orchestrating events rarely invite an independent mind. Vane wanted warning, not intervention. He wanted confirmation of his fears, not their resolution. And yet," I said, "he left the trail open." Holmes smiled faintly. "That was vanity, Watson. A belief that even exposure would take place upon his own terms." He rose and crossed to the mantel, adjusting the little French clock by a fraction. "Observe," he said, "how we treat time. We trust it to proceed without interference. The moment it falters, we demand explanation, culprit, meaning. But time is innocent. It is only the measure." "And men," I said, "supply the motive." "Precisely." As winter gave way to an uncertain spring, the case was spoken of less and less. Ketteridge's trial proceeded without sensation. Pike's testimony, halting and remorseful, carried conviction, and Hale's evidence supplied the necessary context. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Mrs. Vane departed quietly for the continent. Holmes received a final letter from her, thanking him not for his brilliance but for his restraint. He showed it to me without comment and then placed it away among his papers. "That," he said, "is gratitude I value." Life at Baker Street resumed its accustomed rhythms. Clients came and went. Holmes alternated between intense activity and long, silent reveries. Yet from time to time, usually when the evening light fell at a particular angle or the ticking of the mantel clock grew momentarily insistent, my thoughts would return to Rotherham House and that tall, silent witness in the corner of the library. One evening, as Holmes and I sat together after dinner, I voiced this sentiment aloud. "You have taken a liking to that clock," Holmes observed. "I think," I said, "that it has become for me a symbol." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Of the danger of certainty," I replied. "Everyone believed they knew what it meant the moment they saw it stopped." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A dangerous belief indeed. Certainty is a poor substitute for understanding." He took up his violin and played a few slow, deliberate notes, testing the resonance of the room. "Watson," he said suddenly, "promise me something." "What is it?" "That you will never allow the reader to imagine that this case hinged upon a clever trick alone." "I have tried to avoid that," I said. "Good," Holmes replied, "because the true pivot was not the clock nor the wire nor even the letter. It was character." "Ketteridge's?" "And Vane's," Holmes said, "and Pike's, and even Hatherley's. Each man acted according to his nature. The mechanism merely obeyed." He lowered the violin. "The world is full of clocks, Watson. They tick, they stop, they resume. It is men who insist upon winding them with their ambitions." I reflected upon this as I prepared my manuscript for its final posting. Holmes watched me with that indulgent detachment he reserved for my literary labours. "You know," he remarked, "there will be those who insist the clock was the most interesting part." I smiled. "Let them. It will keep them from looking too closely at themselves." Holmes laughed softly. "An admirable defensive strategy." On the night I sent the final pages away, I lingered by the window, watching the lamplight blur upon the damp street. Holmes had already retired, and the house was quiet save for the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. I listened to it for a long time, thinking of all that sound had come to represent, not fate, nor menace, nor mystery, but persistence, the steady continuation of moments indifferent to human schemes, yet forever shaped by them. In the end, that was the lasting impression the case left upon me. Not the ingenuity of the crime, nor even the elegance of its unravelling, but the humility it demanded. The recognition that no mechanism, however carefully prepared, can absolve a man of responsibility for the use to which he puts it. Holmes understood this instinctively. It was why he never gloried in resolution, never lingered upon triumph. To him, the solution of a case was merely the restoration of order, the clearing away of illusion. As for the clock that stopped at murder, it resumed its ticking, unseen and unremarked, in a quiet country house. Time moved on as it always does, leaving behind it only the faint impression of what men attempted, and failed, to impose upon it. And thus, with no final flourish and no lingering mystery, the case came to rest. Not because every question had been answered, but because the essential ones had.
Holmes, I know, would have had it no other way.
It is the peculiar fate of certain cases that they end not with a sudden snap, like a cord drawn too tight, but with a gradual easing, as though the tension, once understood, simply releases its hold upon the mind. Such was the conclusion of the affair of the clock that stopped at murder. Some days after the proofs had left my hands and the machinery of justice had begun its steady, indifferent turn, I found Holmes seated once more upon the sofa, his long fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed, not upon the room but somewhere far beyond it. The violin lay untouched at his side, and the fire had sunk to a thoughtful glow. "You are done with it at last," he said, without looking at me. "I am," I replied, "unless you tell me that I have misunderstood the heart of it." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, you have captured it well enough that others will mistake the clock for the culprit. And that does not trouble you?" "No," he said. "It reassures me." I raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Because," Holmes replied, "it proves that the reader, like the criminal, is tempted by surface explanation. The stopped clock is convenient. It allows one to believe that events pivot upon objects rather than decisions." He rose and crossed to the mantel, where the little French clock ticked on with exemplary modesty. "Kettridge believed," Holmes continued, "that if he could anchor attention to a single dramatic detail, everything else would dissolve into insignificance. He relied upon human impatience, the desire to name a cause quickly and move on." "And yet," I said, "it was precisely that detail which drew you in." Holmes inclined his head. "Because I distrust convenience. When a thing presents itself too readily as explanation, it invites examination." He turned back to me, his expression suddenly serious. "Let us state it plainly, Watson. Cornelius Vane was not killed by a clock nor even by a wire. He was killed by a network of character flaws, his own and those of the men around him. The clock merely marked the instant at which those flaws converged. I thought then of Jonathan Hale's visit, of the warning letter, of Vane's decision to proceed with dinner and ritual rather than flight." "He chose to stand his ground," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "because he believed himself the most intelligent man in any room. Such men mistake awareness for immunity." "And Kettridge?" Holmes's mouth tightened. "A lesser man, but more desperate. He mistook urgency for necessity. He believed that because something must be done quickly, it must also be done cleverly. That error is the downfall of many a schemer." I nodded slowly. And Pike?" "A tragic accessory," Holmes said quietly. "He possessed skill without judgment and obedience without conscience. The world is full of such men, Watson. They oil the gears of crimes they do not design." There was a pause, filled by the ticking of the clock and the distant rumble of the city. "You have not spoken of Hatherley," I said at last. Holmes's eyes softened. "Because Hatherley is the quiet lesson of the case. He obeyed out of fear, delayed out of doubt, and survived out of honesty. His restraint spared him the fate of bolder men." "And Mrs. Vane?" Holmes turned away. "She will live. That is resolution enough." The following week brought a final letter from Lestrade, brief, official, and conclusive. The trial had ended as expected. Kettridge was sentenced. Pike, spared the harshest penalty, was removed from the world he had misunderstood. The estate of Wrotham House passed quietly out of the family's hands. The clock was returned, its presence no longer remarked upon. I read the letter aloud. Holmes listened without comment. "So," I said, folding the paper, "it is finished." Holmes shook his head. "Finished cases are a fiction, Watson. Consequences persist. He took up his violin at last and drew from it a slow, reflective air, one of those wandering melodies which seem to gather the fragments of thought and lay them gently to rest. When he had done, he set the instrument aside and regarded me with that half-smile which had accompanied so many revelations. "There is one final observation you may include if you wish," he said. "I am listening." "That the clock did not lie," Holmes said. "It told the exact truth. It stopped when violence ceased. What misled men was not the time it showed, but the meaning they imposed upon it." I smiled. "Then the mystery was never about when he died." "Precisely," said Holmes. "It was about why everyone wished the clock to explain it for them." The fire burned low. Outside, Baker Street moved on, oblivious and persistent. Somewhere, I knew, another clock marked another hour in another quiet room, waiting patiently for men to project upon it their fears and ambitions. As I gathered my papers and prepared to close my account, I felt once more that familiar mixture of admiration and humility which Holmes's work so often inspired. He had not merely exposed a crime, he had stripped it of its pretensions. He had shown that beneath every elaborate device lies a simple truth, that no mechanism can absolve a man of responsibility, and no symbolism can conceal intention from one who
knows where to look. Holmes, for his part, seemed already to have dismissed the matter from his mind.
He stood at the window, watching the evening settle over London, his figure outlined against the lamplight. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "Time, after all, does not wait for reflection." And as the clock upon the mantel continued its quiet, faithful ticking, I closed my notebook, content that this final page required no embellishment. The case had spoken for itself, clearly, logically, and, in its own restrained way, conclusively. Thus ended the affair of the clock that stopped at murder, not with spectacle, but with understanding, not with wonder, but with truth,